Sword and Sorcery. A movie genre that isn't that popular today, but back in the 80s it was at its peak, with great classics such as Conan the Barbarian, Lady Hawk, the Beastmaster, and Hawk the Slayer. Sword and Sorcery movies existed long before their peak in the 80s, however, and arguably Die Nibelungen from 1924 being the first Sword and Sorcery movie. The 80s boom of Sword and Sorcery could be thanks to the success of Star Wars, which is pretty much a sci-fi Sword and Sorcery movie. It has all the classic tropes. It has a young wizard slash swordsman, often pretty much a wizard and a swordsman, or just a swordsman, an older evil counterpart, and a princess and some trusty sidekicks. I was going to say it was missing the classic bikini women trope of most Sword and Sorcery movies, but due to episode 6 that isn't true. Hawk the Slayer, however, does not have this trope, which doesn't really matter as it usually doesn't affect the story or plot, it's more just eye candy really, so it doesn't affect Hawk at all. The main difference between most Sword and Sorcery movies and Star Wars is that the stakes in Star Wars are much higher, with the Galactic Empire blowing up planets, and the movie is just not as dark as most Sword and Sorcery movies. There are plenty of Star Wars clones, but thanks to the success of Star Wars, we were gifted with a ton of Sword and Sorcery movies, such as the epic, known only as
Beyond the edge of darkness, there is a world of sword and sorcery.
Now, we are immediately introduced to our antagonist Voltan, played by Jack Palance, and protagonist Hawk, played by John Terry, which sets up their connection for the rest of the movie, as well as that we learn that they are
two blood brothers, out for each other.
Next, after the epic intro sequence, we are introduced to one of the main characters, early on at least. He isn't that prevalent later on, but that is Ranulf, aka Knight, played by W. Morgan Shepherd, and we see him run in the forest, fleeing from the forces of darkness, aka Voltan's army, and is sheltered by the sanctuary of the church, where his wounds are healed, but sadly his hand is lost, which honestly doesn't seem to bother him at all, especially since he has a fully automatic crossbow. But after his introduction, we are introduced to the Abbess, played by Annette Crosby, who is the driving factor of the plot. And after her, we'll get a proper introduction of Voltan, the Dark One, the Devil's Agent, and so on and so forth, who kidnaps the Abbess and thus starting the plot as the church seeks out Hawk for help. Now, there isn't really any reason for Voltan to kidnap the Abbess. Like, yeah, sure, the plot is built around it, but if Voltan is supposed to be this big evil, why does he care about kidnapping the Abbess? And why does he care about gold? It just doesn't seem like he needs the money. And if it does, then why doesn't he just raid cities for gold? He's already winning the war according to some exposition we get later on in the movie. So it never really made any sense to me why Voltan is so obsessed with kidnapping the Abbess and the gold. But anyway, when we are reintroduced to Hawk, which is slightly older perhaps, as we don't really get a good sense of time in the movie, but it is mentioned that the armies of darkness, as in Voltan's army, have been attacking for years at this point. Now we see Hawk's heroics and morals maybe, he's mainly like morally grey as most SMS protagonists are. Now we see him save a witch, but we don't really learn anything about Hawk. Hawk doesn't really seem to have any kind of personality, which will be more prevalent later on in the movie, but as of now, he's just a blank slate, of pure epicness however. The rescue of the witch leads us to the first fight scene of the movie, which shows another problem with the movie. Naturally the fight is quite 80s cheesy, but the fight is mainly just jump cuts. It cuts during, before and after each and every single strike, which just doesn't make the fight feel that fluid. And every single fight, except for the last one, just has the same feeling because they all just do it the same. The witch, easily my second most favorite character in the movie, turns out to be one of the driving factors of the plot, as she uses her magic to teleport Hawk to his old companions to recruit them. Which makes you wonder, what was Hawk's plan if he didn't just stumble upon the witch in the forest? Because without her, most of the movie couldn't happen, since she teleports Hawk to recruit his crew, so I just don't see what was Hawk's plan if he didn't randomly stumble upon the witch. Speaking of Hawk's crew, we get introduced to them one by one, starting off with Gort, the giant, played by Bernard Bresslaw. And honestly, out of everyone of Hawk's crew, I probably like the giant the most. The giant is the classic big, strong, stupid type, which usually I don't really like, but he has the most personality out of anyone in Hawk's crew. And also he has the most promising fight scene in the movie, as he takes out a bunch of guys just by himself. Now the giant also does have some comedic moments, shared with another member of the crew, that being Baltin the dwarf, played by Peter O'Farrell. The dwarf is the classic funny, tricky, hungry man, another archetype which I'm not a huge fan of. And I don't really see why Hawk's crew needs him, as you never really see his combat skills. But his introduction at least is quite good, with members of the church trying to burn him alive because he is so ugly that he doesn't deserve to live. But Hawk just appearing resolves the conflict instantly. So out of everyone of Hawk's crew, the dwarf is the only one who doesn't solve his own problem. Which makes you question again, why does Hawk's crew need him? And sure, Hawk does help the others by simply just popping up into existence, like he helps the Crow, aka the elf, played by Ray Charlson, by saving him from being stabbed in the back. Elf is the tragic badass character who is so tragic from his own badass story. And I just don't see him as this badass that the movie sets him out to be. Like, all of his badass moments come from his introduction, which is just him winning an archery duel. He is also an automatic archer, because each time he shoots, it's cut and an arrow is instantly back in the bow. After the recruitment arc, they need to get some money for the Apis' ransom, so they rob some slavers, and brutally murder them, but without any blood, since Hawk is not rated M, like a lot of other SNS movies at the time, such as Conan the Barbarian, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, not having blood doesn't exactly ruin the movie, but it does kind of take you out of the immersion at times, at least in my opinion. Like when Hawk cuts the gut of an enemy in one of the few non-jump cutted action scenes, his foe just grabs his tummy and falls over as Hawk slides his blade across his gut and the blade comes out clean. Now I get that there might be multiple reasons as to why this was done. Maybe to reach a broader audience, or so it could be shown on TV during the day, therefore leading to a higher viewing score once it went out of theatres. But for me at least, it does kind of take you out of the immersion. Back to the plot. Later in the movie, when you get some backstory via flashbacks, we learn that Voltan has always just kind of been this way, which shouldn't be surprising considering that his parents named him Voltan. Of course he was going to be evil. Who wouldn't be evil if their name was Voltan? Especially considering that his younger brother got a fairly normal name of just Hawk. It's like his parents set him out to be evil from the get-go. And Voltan also is his real name, not just an evil persona he took on later on. Speaking of evil, eventually we get a triumphant fight between the forces of evil and good. The witch from earlier comes in again and is the real MVP. Without her, pretty much none of this story would have happened, but Hawk gets all of the glory. Maybe it's just because the world hates witches or something, but the witch never gets any recognition for anything she did, which is everything. We also never learn her name. Hawk just calls her witch or woman. The climatic finale also just doesn't do a ton for me. It doesn't have any emotion in it. The fight between Hawk and Voltan is kind of solid and not only jump cuts, but instead only slow motion. While yes, the slow motion does add drama and intensity, it's not the best sword fight in the SNS genre, or just in general really, but Voltan's face at least is kind of intense during it. Out of everyone, Voltan shows the most emotion and character in the movie, and Jack Palance is really good at just being evil, and at times kind of intimidating, mainly when he just stands there with his sword. By the end of the fight, we get to see what the other half of Voltan's face looks like under his helmet, which they built up the entire movie, and I have to say, I was very disappointed. I expected so much more, since he keeps on yapping on about how much his wound hurts him and torments him, but it's just a burn wound from a few years ago. Now don't get me wrong, it's not a pretty wound, and I get why he hides it, but we also just don't get a reaction from anyone about his face. I mean, the only reaction we get from Hawk in general is just an emotional scream earlier in the movie when he just says quite loudly, Votan! So by all means, the movie is not perfect. Arguable if it even qualifies as a good movie at all. But why do people love it? Personally, I love that the world seems to have so much lore that we only get a tiny glimpse of. Hawk is weirdly epic for whatever reason, and Voltan is just fun evil really. And the witch is awesome. The side characters, however, are really just whatever, I don't care about them. The movie has subpar action at best, no real complex characters or even character development, and not a complex plot by any means. But that's just kind of a staple of most SNS movies, the plot is never really that complex. But despite all of its flaws, people still love Hawk. Many saying it's their favourite SNS movie and desperately want a sequel or more stories from the world. The movie even sets up a sequel and ending, but sadly we never got to see more out of Hawk's world. Now even if Hawk has no personality as a character, I and many Hawk fans still love him for whatever reason, and want to see a sequel with an older Hawk with more personality, and to see the full power of the Mind Sword, since it's set up as this immensely powerful artifact. But basically it's just like when the Jedi in Star Wars throw their lightsabers and pull them back with the Force. So even if it's not the best Sword and Sorcery movie ever made, it's still one of my favorites, simply just because the lore of the world is so interesting. Hawk does everything a Sword and Sorcery movie should do, which most of all is just to be fun and an epic fantasy. And Hawk does all of that so well that it truly shows the art of Sword and Sorcery done right. But not the art of cinema, as the movie is not a good movie.